Good afternoon, everyone. Support for today's program comes from Simulate Corporation, and you can learn about Simulate's intuitive simulation software by visiting the Open Mic Friday section of our website, www.c4SCS.org. I'm Bob Celeste, and welcome to Open Mic Friday, where we have discussions that I consider to be interesting people doing interesting things. If you're on the live broadcast, just to let you know that all the lines are muted right now. But if you use the raise your hand or type in a question, I'll open up your line and you can talk to our guests directly. And speaking of our guests, Ron Guido is president of LifeCare Services, a consulting firm specializing in brand protection, anti-counterfeiting technologies, and supply chain integrity. He's also former VP of Global Brand Protection for Johnson & Johnson, and Ron is regularly asked to speak on topics of identifying breaches to supply chain security and corrective action programs. Ron, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Bob. It's great to be here.
Ron, we met quite a few number of years ago and it was actually at a brand protection program, or rather a conference. And what I was struck by was the different, I don't want to say mindset, but different perspective than what the folks that I'd been working with in, say, supply chain and IT around track and trace and things like that. And it was kind of interesting, especially I remember your discussion and how you couch things around protecting brands and the process that you go through. Can you just give us a little bit of background on how you came to this and,
Sure.
and your perspective?
Yeah, and it really was a new business discipline at the time for Johnson & Johnson and as many organizations, not only in the pharma industry, but across all industry verticals. We're trying to figure out what are we doing with this increase in the number of incidents that we're finding in the brand protection area. Okay, brands being violated by all sorts of things, not only fake goods, but breaches to normal trade. It could be diversion or pricing arbitrage, could be tampering with the product, up-labeling, all sorts of things. And we realized that the number of incidents that were coming in, and by the way, this is probably precipitated by a lot of factors, most notably, I think, would be the opening up of global commercial trade lanes, right? That we were sourcing goods from overseas more readily. We're going through a lot of free trade zones, and then up in the developed markets where the prices are higher. So just the global trade has all sorts of advantages, but I think one of the unintended consequences of that proliferation of trade were brand protection incidents. And heretofore, we were treating these things as isolated incidents and typically would be managed by either a security personnel, either inside a company or a hired investigation firm, or the lawyers would get involved and be a trademark violation and sending out letters. And these organizations were getting inundated with what I call the see and treat episodes rather than looking at it from a business perspective. And really, the topic I want to focus on is just that, the brand protection and supply chain integrity as a business discipline, much like we developed disciplines around marketing or quality assurance or finance. Well, brand protection is one of those relatively new disciplines that requires the same focus, based upon how large should the organization be, what protocols you follow, what kind of talent you need, what technology do you adopt, and so on. So that's how we took a look at this. My particular background before this, I never had an idea where brand protection would take me, but I grew up in the organization, starting in a technical role as a manufacturing engineer and then moving to sales and marketing roles. Had some good fortune of working in international markets. So when you look at what would be the ideal job description of a brand protection professional, it would be someone who's worked as far and wide in the company and across many disciplines, because you really can't get anything done without the rest of the organization supporting you. And that's why we saw it as something that needed to be elevated in the organization, report into a high level part of the group. I chose supply chain because I figured that's where most of the recovery could take place. Most of the implementation of protection could be there. So, but it doesn't matter. I mean, when you think of brand protection, your knee-jerk reaction is, oh, it's got to be in a marketing group because it's the branding. But and that may be the case for some product lines, but I believe brand protection is really a supply chain integrity discipline.
Interesting. So two things. One is that you talked about the sort of see and treat, and I think, are you talking about sort of a reaction to things that occur rather than being proactive and trying to thwart something that might take place?
Absolutely. And I'll answer that, Bob, in a quick anecdote. When I took over the role, the first person I went to was the head of corporate security. And I said, how many counterfeits have we had last year? And his response was 24. And I thought, this is going to be a pretty easy job, like 2 a month for a company that was probably $60 billion in sales at the time. But the reality of it is I'm sure many people on the call know, is that we didn't have our antenna up. We weren't capturing all these incidents. And when you start putting in, like a business discipline would, a measuring system, the metrics and so on, you start to see the hundreds and hundreds of incidents that may have been handled locally or ignored. And that's where you get your information on how to now put in corrective programs, because you've got a database of incidents that follow certain patterns. So I think elevating it from a see and treat security group, focusing on it with some help from law enforcement or the legal department, to the business side of things. What changes can we make in our supply chain, in our management of our trading partners and so forth? That's where the incidents start to come into focus. And then, of course, you put in the recovery or the corrective actions.
So did the number of incidents go up once you started to treat this more as a process?
I'm probably not at liberty to give you a number, but hundreds fold. And it's funny because after about 3 years in a role, in this role, I went to my boss and I said, "Hey, we only had 24 incidents. Now we're up around 1,000. I deserve a bonus." So it's the counterintuitive nature, which we always talk about in the brand protection world. It's different than legitimate trade and growing sales and so forth. This is something where it's the undercurrent of trade that makes you think differently than you would as a marketer, or as ship as much product as you can to every corner of the earth and you'll get a lot of revenue for it. This is something we had to really recalibrate our thinking as to what's good trade versus what's dangerous trade.
I didn't realize till you just said it a little while ago that you came from a rather engineering background. And so that kind of makes sense that you might take this role on as you said before, more of a, I don't know what to say, cops and robbers kind of environment, to one where you start to fit in a process and start to build, more professionalism. I don't want to say, but you know what I mean, more process into the process.
Well, that's right. And again, this job posting, it was actually a vice president job posting internal to the company, and it listed requirements. And I give credit to the people who put this together, because at the time it was a brand new group, of course, so we really didn't know what we needed in terms of staffing and credentials of people. But it talked about having a technical background with preferred, international experience preferred, marketing preferred. And it wasn't until we got into the business we realized that, any discipline can be brought into this organization and contribute, because it was more than just a knowledge of the supply chain or global markets. It had a lot to do with bringing together disparate groups across the organization, finance and quality control and supply chain and so on, as well as outside folks, and working with government folks. In fact, working with competitors, because a lot of what we did was cross-industry, and there was no competitive advantage to saying my supply chain is safe and yours isn't. We wanted to make sure that the entire industry was being protected from the bad guys. So really took you far and wide, from not just technical work or working with the brand owners, but basically the entire enterprise-wide set of disciplines was touched upon as we developed the expertise under brand protection.
I remember a few years ago that we sort of saw a spike in trailer thefts, and it seemed to me, at least from as an outsider, it seemed like industry, as you talked about, competitors came together and regulators came together in order to address the problem, and it was very quick. I mean, it wasn't within a year where we saw that kind of diminish quite a bit.
Well, that's an interesting example, actually. If I could just segue a bit, one of the things brand protection needed to do to justify itself is put some metrics together, not only on incidents, but what's the cause and effect of your work, meaning what kind of revenue are going to save or recovery of lost revenue or avoid cost and so forth. And one of the areas was actually in cargo theft, where we started to see our insurance premiums spike because trailers were being stolen from depots and through no fault of our own, and the law enforcement would be contacted, but the net effect is we were paying a small fortune in premiums due to not having the protection on the trailers. And when I say we, I'm not talking about my company, I'm talking about the entire industry, particularly in pharma. And there were some landmark cases that I'm sure some of you on the phone remember, of warehouses being robbed of $70 million worth of pharmaceuticals. But when we started to put in some protective measures on the trailers, like GPS units, or having some new rules of engagement, not stopping at a rest stop that's off a service road unless you had two drivers in the vehicle, one going in for food, the other remaining, a whole set of best practices evolved from that. And sure enough, in these hotbeds, particularly in the central part of the United States, we saw a decrease in those crimes. And we took credit for it, if you will, in terms of something very tangible, the reduction of premiums for the insurance against stolen goods.
That's really interesting. I didn't think about the tie-in there between how you would, how that would affect you financially, from specifically to your point about insurance premiums rising because of this issue, and then being able to address that with technology, best practices, and some professional connections in order to shut that down.
Yeah, and it's again, it's an industry-wide problem. So we didn't believe that in any counterfeit category that the bad guys were going after one company or one product line. They were very opportunistic. They didn't have strategic plans against various, competing companies in this space. So we figured that banding together and exchanging best practices and going as a unified voice to the regulators, to the legislators, to third parties, having this insight that we were able to deliver did change the regulatory landscape. It changed some of the laws around anti-counterfeiting, and just elevated the awareness across the industry and with consumers and patients. So I think that's where we're at now, is we're looking at this as, trust with verification, rather than just instinctively trusting that the goods you receive in a shipment are what they're supposed to be.
You had talked about earlier, you sort of talked about a number of things that were going on as far as, how you see intrusions into brand protection, such as arbitrage, up-labeling. Can you talk a little bit more about how the industry is under attack, the kinds of things that are pressure-wise?
So when you talk about violations of a brand protection nature or breaches to supply chain, it's everything from the classic definition of a counterfeit, but it also could be things that are more subtle, like in the case of pharmaceuticals, up-labeling from a dose, instead of 20 milligrams, put on the bottle label 30 milligrams and selling it for the higher price. It could be changing the expiration date. In my definition, if you change an expiration date, that's now a counterfeit good. But again, you could have a legitimate product that's expired and is maybe destined for destruction, because that's what we do. If product, and you may know this in pharmaceuticals, nothing is put back on the shelf. So if you have a return good, it's destroyed.
Mhm.
But we've seen situations, not necessarily in my company, where those trucks heading to the dumping ground or the incinerator would be rerouted and labels changed, and now expired product has a new fresh label and it's being sold at the premium prices. So there's a lot to brand protection that's more than just looking for fake goods. It's looking for any sort of violation of trade. Products that are regulated from a regulated standpoint are only approved, say, in Western Europe or in Japan, and they show up in other markets where the regulatory approvals have not been received. So is that fake? Is it diverted goods? It's some of these things are causing problems with patients. They're causing problems because of the exposure. They're not handled properly. Cold chain products, cancer drugs, and so forth may be exposed to ambient conditions that render them less effective. So the efficacy breaches that go along with illicit trade are also part of the umbrella of brand protection.
As far as the, and what's interesting is that you pointed out a number of different kinds of attacks, and a lot of them that you wouldn't normal, let's say, I don't know, normal, just an everyday person may not realize are something that people will do. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of wide or the variation you see in the sophistication of these kind of nefarious attacks?
Well, I think if you have a see and treat mentality, you're going to see everything as a one-off. Everyone, you're going to feel like you're a victim, and every incident has to be treated as an individual, track it down, and so on. Then you go crazy on doing that, because we do see everything, all sorts of trade taking place. People buying legitimate product at big box stores and breaking it down and selling it at flea markets for an upcharge. I mean, there's all sorts of things that go on. But again, back to what brand protection should look like, you've got to step back and say, how do we mature ourselves as a business, as a full enterprise, and look at every aspect of what we're doing to help prevent these things from happening. Sometimes, and when I'm speaking at these conferences, I make a bold statement like, you can never prevent a counterfeit, and you can't. The counterfeit, the people who are intent on making false versions of your products are always going to be in play. The trick is to prevent those counterfeit goods from getting into the legitimate supply chain. So whatever flavor that violation takes, if you're putting the protection in your legitimate supply chain and instilling those best practices down through the supply chain to your trading partners, to the retailers or the dispensers of your product, to dealerships, if that happens to be the part of your marketing network, I think those best practices have more value than looking at whether or not a product was up-labeled or changed the expiration date, or been exposed to elements that render it less efficacious. What's interesting, though, also, Bob, about when you go to the conferences, particularly the ones that are cross-industry, it's amazing at what you learn from the automobile industry and what they're subjected to, or the airline industry. I went to a conference where we spent 20 minutes talking about stolen bicycle seats and fake bicycle seats. And
Really?
like, who knew? Who knew that would be a target? But I guess if there's a business opportunity, somebody's going to falsify your brand and your product.
Yeah, I saw once and I wish I wrote this gentleman's name down because I would quote him on my slides, where he said the only products that are not counterfeit are ones that no one wants.
That's true. Again, some of the sound bites you pick up along the way. If your product's not counterfeit, there's one of two things at play. One is you're not paying attention, or second, your product is really poor.
Really?
And you think about when you look at the seizures that come in at the borders, year in and year out, it's always the high volume, high valued products, the media products, all the DVDs and so forth. It's the apparel, the Louis Vuitton handbags and dresses and so on. I mean, there are fake bridal gowns out there that people buy off the internet. And then pharmaceuticals are in that third category, the third most common category, but right on down the list, it's everything. High value, high volume is where the counterfeiters make most of their money.
Interesting. I want to get into the practice and the programmation of this, but I do have a few people that would like to talk to you, and I'm going to open up a line here for Carl Accentura. And Carl?
Hey, Carl. Ron, great talk. I just wanted to bridge on what you were saying about the cargo security with respect to the Pharmaceutical Cargo Security Coalition and the RX360 groups.
Yes. You want me to elaborate on that, Carl?
Sure, sure.
Yeah, this is a great example, two examples actually, where in the cargo theft area, the security groups of many of the pharma companies came together and working, again, with people from DC, really put together a coalition on what should be done, what kind of new regulations we might adopt, and certainly the best practices. And it became widely publicized as one of those great collaborations across an industry and working with the public sector to put in new regulations, new laws around cargo security. And that continues today as one of the real success stories in the industry. The RX360, there were 9 of us that began that out of DC. Again, Pfizer, Merck, and a lot of other companies, Amgen, got together and said, all right, and there's a lawyer in the room to make sure you're not talking about all this stuff you're not supposed to talk about relative to pricing and so on. But we just said, what are the best practices and what do we need to come together and talk about this subject on a regular basis, not only for the US, but on a global basis. And that organization grew, and I know there's probably 30 or more companies represented in there now. But again, we had people sitting in from the government, from Border Protection and from some of the other agencies that were helping to regulate the safety and security of pharmaceuticals. And that's another great success story of how an industry cares about the industry rather than trying to look for a competitive advantage by flying solo in this space.
Oh, absolutely. And the regulators, FDA and others, are quite willing to participate in those kinds of efforts.
Yeah, we've seen that from the beginning with the track and trace regulations, right? That I'm sure you know about, Carl, and Bob's certainly been a big part of, starting with the states developing their own track and trace laws or e-pedigree systems, California being, I guess, the most prominent, which then led to the national law that's on the books today, and everyone's racing toward implementing the serialization programs for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Bob, if you like, I could just go through a couple items that I had around this maturation process of the business discipline. One item we started to talk about is technology. And if you think back, those of you who've been part of brand protection for a while, you know that in the early days, we used to use something called holograms. And we chuckle at how we thought that was going to solve everything, that if you put a fancy hologram on your label or on your package, that the counterfeiters would look at that and say, well, I can't replicate that. I'm just going to shy away from it and go on to some other brand. And then the next generation was having some combination of overt and covert markings, maybe even a forensic label that could be used in court. And then we said, okay, well, that's fine for point authentication, but over the course of an episode through the supply chain with all the handoffs, we needed track and trace. And now we're using serial numbers as unique identifiers for our goods at different layers of packaging so that at any point in time, you can see what that pedigree or the chain of custody of the goods has been, and maybe look where, if there are serial numbers that are absent, you can say, well, these goods don't belong here, and then swim back upstream and find out where they came in. But I think the most exciting part of the technology evolution, or the maturation of the technology side of brand protection, is really in data analytics. The business intelligence that all of our companies have at their disposal, and looking at those data through the lens of brand protection. So for instance, if a distributor typically buys 100 units of you in a month, and all of a sudden that drops to 70, your data would jump out and say, what's going on here? Why has the demand been lower? Are they buying that from someone else? Hence maybe a pricing arbitrage situation, or did something legitimate happen? You know, you lost an account or so on. I think that's a small example on how big data analytics is going to be, and maybe it's already becoming, the best tool we have in the technology toolkit for protecting the supply chain. And companies are realizing that's good for understanding their customers, trends in buying habits and so on. But more importantly, the brand protection people are starting to get involved in saying, well, we could benefit from those data as well, and let's look at big data sets to find perhaps trends in breaches to supply.
Quick question, Ron, can you hear me? This is Peter Ebert, Crypto Work. And thank you. This is really precious information. I was wondering, in this digital transformation world, where do you see any data counterfeits already? And if so, which ones?
No, it's a good question. Well, I think we all know the answer to that, and it's yes. If you look at how their data breaches on our personal information, well, there's data breaches on corporate information as well, in terms of everything from the flow of goods to the pricing of the goods to the regulations around our products to who our suppliers are, who our customers are, and protecting, I'll use the word corporate databases, is very important to a brand protection program, because without it, you're really dealing with the first generation of counterfeiters. The more sophisticated generation of counterfeiters are looking to hijack your product through redirecting goods or making purchases from within your supply chain that are not authorized. So everything from contract pricing to cost of goods sold to customer list, everything is at risk in today's digital world. And when you think about how many personal cell phones are used in the course of business, how many personal computers are used to conduct business, particularly in the sales realm where you have a distributed sales force. A lot of that information that, it's not just your personal information is being hijacked, it's your business information from your company.
And in addition, so what we see in other industries, in particular aerospace and defense, there is data manipulation. And so it's stealing of data, but it's also kind of straight manipulation. Also, you could actually find yourself in a situation where your pricing list has been manipulated because somebody got into your system. Is that something you see as well, or you see what we call digital twins of supply chain items that are represent?
Both are out there, and what's difficult about it is it's not in the normal course of business, so you may not see it at any point of transaction. You might not discover it for later in the reporting period, or maybe not at all, and you just gets lost in the bundle. And think about it, and we always say this: you got to think like a bad guy in order to have a strong brand protection program. And if all of us on a call wanted to go rogue and go into the counterfeit business, we're not going to go after the big things. It's not like going into a bank and robbing all the money in the bank because that's an acute episode of an attack. You're going to do it in subtle ways. You're going to siphon off product or siphon off some of the data within the databases that you hack into, and hopefully it goes undetected for a long time. The counterfeiters want to live to do their thing another day, so they're going to be very clandestine about their practices and what they're what they're using. They don't want to make one big score and then go away. So yeah, I think with the globalization of trade comes a lot of the problems that go far beyond what any one brand protection group can handle. It's got to be something that is addressed at the government level, at the industry level, and we're seeing that taking place, but perhaps not enough going on.
Yeah, I think that's what Thanks so much.
So Ron, how would you two questions. One is the process of kind of programming brand protection, and then the other one is we often have a lot of people that are from IT areas on our calls. How would they work together with the brand protection department, if you will?
Right. I mentioned before that when we first put together our group, we didn't really have job descriptions that we knew of. We said we probably need people who are familiar with the legal processes. We need people who have international understanding of markets. We need some technology folks, IT and other technologies. And sure enough, as that is come into focus over the years, we realize that the battle is fought on many fronts. So you do need the tactical people who can go out into the field and look at individual violations for a channel of trade or a product line. But more in aggregate, I think the IT department, once they're sensitized to, the normal flow of trade and commercial data and what breaches can take place, now they can set up the listening posts and do what I would call the risk assessment, if you will, in each of these channels. We used to look at risk in 3 dimensions. It's either the brand risk, meaning certain products like Nike sneakers are more vulnerable than other brands. So the product category had a risk value. The channel of trade, right? The internet being the most corrupt channel of trade we have. And then the country or the market that you're dealing in, because let's face it, there are certain markets that they call counterfeits generic products and they're willing to buy counterfeits at a lower price. So when you do the mix of those 3 risk factors and blend it into your business discipline, you start to identify what to look for, how to do random checks, how to have alerts that come up when there's an anomaly in a normal trade pattern. So the IT group knows how to do that really well, to mine information, to mine the data, and look at it through a number of different lenses. And I know large organizations that are doing that quite well right now. And what happens as a byproduct of that brand protection analyses? You're feeding back, you're informing marketing with more information than they had previously, because you're looking at different data sets in different ways.
Interesting. And to your point about the internet being the worst area around this, and it's kind of a slippery area, because it's not like you have a physical plant that you have to move if you're a counterfeiter. You don't have to even drive your car around. You're just electronic at that point.
Well, we did a lot of lobbying over the years in Washington because, as everyone knows, drug prices, everybody feels there's price gouging and they're very expensive, not paying attention to all the failures of the drug development programs that are underway, and you've got to put the price on the ones that are successful and get through the regulatory hurdles. But what we found is that so many rogue websites were promoting product where some of the big warning signs is no prescription needed for a regulated drug. I mean, that right there should send you a warning saying if no prescription, then it's got to be a rogue site. At least most of the time it is, or a misspelling of a word, because a lot of these pharmaceutical entities have really long, strange names to them as their base generic name. So, if there's misspelling there, that would pop out and say, well, you may want to take another look at this website, or if the price is just 80% off. And that's the kind of the thing we would promote in Washington, is saying that what would make a drug coming in from Canada so much cheaper? Why would it be 50% cheaper just because it's being sourced through a different country? And I think our biggest problem to date remains internet sales of pharmaceuticals. It's just poorly regulated. You can't find a place on the ground where these things originate, and it's still a very dangerous channel of trade.
Is there a consumer education aspect of this?
Yeah, Bob, this is an interesting thing, because when we talk about the maturation of brand protection, in the early days when security was handling these whispers of a counterfeit, the 20 or so that happened a year, it was almost like, let's keep this a secret. Let's not tell anyone, because the last thing we want to do is get the public aware of that there may be counterfeits in this particular company, and they're going to go buy someone else's product. And I think that mentality, fortunately, has faded away. And now we're saying that, the public and the consumer could be our best allies in brand protection, because with QR codes, for instance, where you can talk to the marketing group, not just the pharmaceuticals, but almost any brand, if something's not behaving properly as it should, as it's advertised, and when you're using it, you have now more direct lines of communication back to the legitimate owners of those brands, and you may be the first one to report that, hey, there's some fakes happening. And we've seen that time and time again across industries, where the consumer was the first one to detect that something's not right, and report back. So I think that whole mindset has changed, and saying, let's do a lot of consumer awareness, maybe not on any particular brand, but as a category of brands, or maybe as an industry. There's more and more of that. I mean, we're all well aware that Nike sneakers are counterfeit, and I mentioned Louis Vuitton bags. Well, some brands say, you know what, that's just baked into the numbers. And Louis Vuitton saying that's free advertising, because that's not the customer segment that would buy our real brands anyway, but it's good advertising. I think that's absolutely nonsense. Any fake out there is just fueling, the budgets of those who are building bigger businesses and going after other. Today it could be a $30 handbag, and tomorrow it could be a $2,000 dose of a cancer drug.
Yeah, and do you find that, like, if you do find someone that's either counterfeiting or trading in counterfeit, if there is a inspection of a facility, do you find a lot of other industries' goods in those areas?
Yeah, we've never seen a raid where yields a strategic plan against one particular company, and it's opportunistic. So you see it across brands, and you see it, in a lot of products, whether they be, consumer goods that are purchased over a counter, or in retail, or online, or it could be something that's highly specialized. So we've seen all different flavors of these violations.
Interesting. I think Carl might have another question. Let me just bring Carl back up. Hey, Carl.
Oh, I was just teasing about RFID. Ron and I were on a call, and RFID came up as one of those technologies that was actually pushed by FDA in a lot of their work on the GMPs for the 21st century. But it faded in activity and interest. I was working on a product that had a pouch, and so it was very difficult. And FDA kind of just lost interest in it. The industry moved to 2D barcodes. But I guess what I would say is Ron might want to talk a little bit about there's a blooming array of enabling technologies, I think, now that give us some additional tools that we didn't have 10 years ago.
Yeah, well, again, RFID was and still is an excellent technology, but not for this purpose because you needed the line of sight. And Walmart learned that back in 2005, I think it was, where they were mandating that everybody who wanted to ship into their warehouses had to have pallet loads of RFID responders.
No, Ron, it was actually worse than that. They were specifically looking to have all controlled substances in controlled sealed containers so that the pharmacist never opened the box. They simply put it into the safe after doing an RFID scan. And then there were those of us who had controlled substances that were in aluminum foil pouches who couldn't make it work.
Yeah. And I think as we've evolved, we've seen that there are very specialized. The key around high volume products that are often counterfeit, you don't want to add high volume, expensive technology for the 1% of those goods that are at risk, because again, you're adding unnecessary costs. So we always have to be judicious around the cost benefit of applying technologies. I personally like multi layers of technology. So something that would have a rather inexpensive, say 2D barcode, but also having an authentication mark as part of that mix. Maybe having some different inks that are applied that can be interrogated in the field, not using fancy scanners and so forth. I think the best apps are the ones that are the best technologies, are the ones that could be interrogated using an app on a phone, one of the platforms, whether it be Android or or the iPhone. I think those are the ones where you can disperse the scanners or the checkers throughout the field, give them to customs agents, give them, whatever it might be, because you really want to interrogate these things in the most dangerous place, and it's usually further away from the safe markets or further away from the legitimate brand owners, manufacturing sites. So changing your technology over time is a good thing, and trying them all out. There's no fewer than 50 or 60 overt, covert, and digital technologies right now that are in play across these high-risk industries, and it's fun to see the technology being applied.
Yeah, and Ron, Ron and I are working on a number of things, but one of them that I'm interested in is combining these in a way that suits a certain pathway within pharmaceuticals. For example, the high-value products or rare disease products that go cold chain through to specialty pharmacy. Are there ways in we can use some of this enabling technology? So if you think about the mobile app, it really opens up avenues for, even at the point of dispense to the patient or point of receipt of the prescription by mail to the patient. And if you could embed in that temperature monitors that ensure that the patient gets an authentic product, but it's also traveled safely through, it hasn't been diverted in such a way that it compromised its efficacy. So I think there's going to be some exciting developments as we move forward.
Well, thanks, Carl. I totally agree with that, as you know. Bob, another comment I'd like to make again to the audience. Some of you may be in the brand protection area and others are just curious as to what it's about. I mentioned early on that the talent that's needed in this group going forward would be to bring people in from any number of disciplines. We need everybody. And one thing I didn't realize when we first formed the group, because it was established at a very high level in the organization, but it became a recruitment tool for the next wave of talent into the group. And that is the visibility you have across the organization, dealing with virtually every discipline in the company, every geography, and both inside and outside the company, including, as I mentioned, people in the public sector. What a great place to build a career or to take it to the next level. And I think it's only growing in importance. And just as an idea, when we first put this together, over a decade ago in J&J, we had 12 people. That group's up to 40 now. But more importantly than the 40 in a centralized area, and some of them are distributed around the globe, but more importantly, the technology, the best practices are embedded now and being distributed out into all ranks and all channels of the company, all disciplines. And that's really when you know you've got a strong brand protection program, where it's not just a group of people that are answering all the problems and addressing all the issues, but really to have a sensitivity of the technologies, the best practices, and you know, the awareness of what could go wrong, and have that embedded into your businesses as they're distributed out, not only within the company, but to your trading partners, to your suppliers and freight carriers and so forth. So this brand protection thing is a great place to work, and it carries many different dimensions to it. It taxes all of your experiences and educational credentials, but most importantly, it's got a purview from within the company that very few disciplines can offer. So I encourage you to learn more about it in your company, and if your company doesn't have a formalized brand protection group, you may want to plant the seed with your management and start one, because it's is a very gratifying part of my career. And I, again, in retirement, I still dabble in this. So it's been something that has kept my interest, because this maturation continues, this evolution of best practices and technologies continues.
Interesting aspect as far as learning about a company. I mean, some of these companies are so large that someone new coming into a company, it may take years for them to understand exactly what the company does even, and to be able to see across it all the different aspects and business processes. It's very interesting. Do you find that the group gets pulled into the say business development or business processes that other parts of the organization is doing as a matter of course, because of the groundwork that you've laid with the rest of the company?
Absolutely, Bob. I mean, whenever there's a new product being developed, there's now a brand protection element of that product development work. If there's an acquisition of a company, part of the due diligence of the company would be to look at it through the lens of brand protection. What's their risk profile? Or they've been violated? Do they have protection? So I think that the more and more that you talk about brand protection and the integrity of supply, the more organizations are saying, hey, come and educate us or work with us, or how are we doing in this area? So one of the first things we ever did was very interesting. The call centers that handle complaints from the field or from consumers, we rewrote the scripts to ask a question. So if somebody's having a problem with a product, you could say, well, where did you buy it? Do you always buy it that way? Did the label look different than you usually buy it? And describe more about, you know, what your issues are. Is there an odor coming from the bottle? Is there, you know, so again, this is part of the embedding of brand protection best practices into every aspect of product development and engagement with your consumers and your commercial partners.
And that's interesting, because it gets back to your discussion before about the consumer or the patient who may have a loyalty to a brand, and they may actually know the brand better than the company that actually made it, because they're so, you know, tied to it. They know what it feels like. They know what it looks like, what it smells like.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, not to, you know, ring the alarms, we're still talking about in the U.S. one of the safest markets in the world, and we don't want people to just look at every product they purchase with the jaded view of, you know, this is fake or so on. And again, we talk a lot about pharmaceuticals, where there are reports saying that there's about $80 billion worth of annual sales of fake pharmaceuticals around the world. And in some markets, it's 10%, 20%, 30% of all pharmaceuticals are fake. It's nice to know that in the U.S., the prescription medicines in the U.S., the counterfeit rate is much less than 1%, much less. So it's not like we have a crisis here. However, because of our of how many prescriptions that are written during the course of a year, if that percentage grew to 1%, which again we would say, well, that's still not bad, 1%. It translates into 40 million prescriptions a year in the U.S. So 0.1% is too much. We have a saying that, we've got to have a no tolerance policy against fakes in every industry that we have, even if it's a handbag, because the revenue coming from that is probably fueling a counterfeiter that may someday get into a pharmaceutical or a medical device. So 1% in the U.S. of pharmaceuticals equates to 40 million prescriptions a year. We write over 4 billion a year. So that's why you're looking for a needle in a haystack sometimes, but it's worth the effort. It's worth the search, because you don't want anyone to be harmed due to a fake, particularly when you've got a high brand value, good reputation, and then 99.9% of your business is at risk because you weren't paying attention to 100% of your supply chain.
Well, great, Ron. We're heading up to the top of our hour, and I just want to thank you for being on today. And we may have to ask you to come back as we further investigate this topic and around how industry can work together to kind of thwart these kind of activities. But really appreciate your time today and the work that you've been doing with your team around this area of protecting the supply chain.
Yeah, well, thank you, Bob. I'm grateful for the opportunity. I welcome insights or feedback from those listening, either today or from the future recording of this session. But it's a wonderful experience to have the open mics and talk about these subjects. So I thank you for the privilege of being part of it today. Thanks
a lot. And if you're with us next week, we're going to be having Dirk Rogers, who's Global Regulatory Strategist for Systech. He's been at the forefront of serialization and traceability efforts, and he'll share his thoughts on serialization, traceability, and where we've come from and where we're going. And this will be our last session or show for the year next week. So please join us for that. And Ron, have a happy holidays and look forward to talking to you in 2019.
Thank you, and to all your listeners, happy holiday and safe and joyous New Year.